In this video, I'm going to talk about the function tools that are provided with this framework. Real quick before we get into that, if you haven't seen my other video that talks about how to create custom functions, you should go back and watch that first because we're going to build on the concepts that I described in that one. Let's go down to the customization portion of my help file or my README file. And then from there, let's just scroll down to where I talk about function tools, and I have all of their function definitions here so you can see what parameters they take, what parameters they return, and then there's of course a little documentation blurb for each one of them. So let's start with the write socket function. This is the function that you use to exchange data between the client and the server. And let's go ahead and take a look at how that works. So let's go ahead and open up the client source file. And inside here, I already have some functions defined. The first one is a connect function, so this will execute as soon as the client connects to the server. And the server socket is supplied as the parameter socket inside this function. And of course, you'll see inside it that we have the write socket function here. And what we're basically doing is we're sending the command hello to the server socket, and our payload, I'm just using a random string here that says this is my payload. And let's go ahead and open up the server source file in this window. And I have a command function defined. And let me just scroll down right here so you sort of get a better context of the command function. Right here, I say if I receive the command hello, execute the receive hello command function, and that is this function right up here. And inside this function, I just have a couple printf statements so that we can see that it's executing. In this first one, I am displaying the payload so that we can see that the payload is being transferred and we're properly receiving it on the other end. Something I want to mention about the payload is even though I'm just sending a simple character string, it is possible to send complex data structures through this character string. You just have to serialize them and deserialize them on the other end. I don't actually provide a mechanism for doing that, but there's lots of ways to do that, lots of code online that I think you can borrow and get that done. And finally, at the bottom of this function, we have another write socket command. And this time we're sending data back to the client, which is supplied in the form of this socket parameter, and we're sending the command by, and then our payload is going to be another character string that says disconnecting in 1 second. And if I pop back over to the client side, you can see that I do have a command function set up, and inside it I have a print statement, again just so we can see that it's executing properly, that says we received by from the server. And again, I'm printing out the payload so that we can be sure that we received the payload properly. And again, just to provide some proper context, right here is where I associate the command by with my receive, or rather with my command function that's called receive by. So why don't we go ahead and run them? Let's do a quick make clean here, and then we'll make them. Run the server. Server seems to be running fine. Let's run the client. Now this will probably all happen really fast, so let's see what happens. Okay, there we go. So let me just shut down the server real quick. But we can see right here that as soon as we connected, the connect function executed, it sent hello to the server responded, it said it received hello from socket 5, which is the client socket, and it received this payload, which is this is my payload, which is exactly what we sent from the client, so that's working fine. Then it says sending by command, and if we go back over to the client window, right here, received by command from the server, payload disconnecting in 1 second. So it looks like everything happened exactly like we wanted it to. So you'll also notice that when I did a Control-C on the server, that the client automatically shut down too. The server automatically terminates all client connections when it receives the Control-C. But what I didn't do is I didn't actually disconnect the client from within the functions, from within the custom functions. So why don't I demonstrate that next? So right here, this is the close socket function. This is what will actually terminate client functions from the server side. You can call it on the client side. All it does is terminate the connection to the server and then just disconnects. So let's just go ahead and demonstrate it for the server. Get a copy here. Open up the server file. We'll go down to the receive hello. And right after we send the by command, we'll paste it in here. Close socket, and then of course, as I said earlier, the socket that's provided inside this command function is the socket for the client that we received the initial hello command from. Save that, make the server again, run the server. And let's run the client. Okay, so now you can see that right away, after we received the by command from the server, shutting down, reason server terminated connection. So that's just a quick and easy demonstration of the close socket command. Pretty straightforward. So next, let's talk about the main socket function. This does something different for both the client and the server. For the server, it returns the socket that listens for new client connections. Now, you're almost never going to want to write or close that socket, and I'll demonstrate that a little bit later when we start looping over all of the sockets. For the client, it's actually very useful. For some functions where we're not provided a socket automatically, and we want to write something to the server, we have to use this main socket function to get the socket for the server. So let's go ahead and show how that's done. Inside my client file, let me open that up real quick, if I can type. I've redefined the function we had before. Now it's a periodic function. And so with periodic functions, we're not actually supplied any sort of socket because the execution of a periodic function isn't in response to any sort of socket I/O. So if we want to write to the server or send a command to the server, we need to use this main socket function. So it's really pretty straightforward. Instead of what we had here earlier, which was the socket parameter that we were automatically supplied, now we just replace it with the main socket function. And this is just going to send the command hello with the payload, this is my payload, to the server. Pretty basic. And again, with all custom functions, we have to load them, and I have that periodic function loaded right here. So this should execute every 5 seconds. And let's just take a quick look at the server code. It's mostly the same. We have the same receive hello command function. I took out a few of the extra print commands, but I still have the same original one where we say we received hello from the socket, and it shows that we received the payload as well. Go ahead and run them and see what happens after I build them. Okay, server seems to be running fine. And we should see at 5-second intervals on the server side, there we go, received hello from socket 5, payload, this is my payload. So that is the client sending the server the hello command with the payload at 5-second intervals. And of course we did that through the use of the main socket function. So next, let's talk about the next socket function. This is a tool to loop over all of the connected entities. So for the server, this is going to loop over all of the client connections. For the client, it'll loop over all the server connections, but of course there's only ever one server connection, so there's really not much of a purpose to use it on the client side, because we can just use the main socket function on the client side to get the server socket. So really we're only going to use this on the server side. And since this deals with multiple sockets, first let me show you multiple clients connected to the server at the same time so you can get a sense of what that looks like. So let's go back to our terminal windows and run the server in this one. And now I have 2 terminal windows for the client. We'll run an instance in each one of them. So if I just run one and we watch the server output, the server is going to say it received a hello command from that first client, and that'll happen at 5-second intervals. Now let's connect with the second client. Oops. Okay. And so we should see a new entry here for socket 6, and there it is. So now it's getting two commands from two separate clients, and you can see them both represented in the server output here. Let's close this. So now I'm going to open up my server source file. I have a function defined in it. It's a periodic function, and just like I showed you for the client, inside periodic functions we're not supplied any sort of socket, so we have to either get the socket using the main socket function, or we can, in the case of the server that I'm about to show you now, we can loop over all connected sockets and sort of, perform an action on all of the sockets. So right here you can see an illustration of that loop. Basically it's a while loop, and inside it I use the next socket function to assign a socket from within the socket list to integer s. And as long as the value of integer s is greater than 0, we know we have a valid socket number. So then the next line is, as long as it's not the main socket, then we're going to write a command to that socket. And these three lines will essentially loop over the entire socket list. So I have the load command commented out, so let's uncomment that. We'll make the server. We'll run the server, and we'll go back to our client connections, and we'll connect those again. And now what we should see is, not only are we going to see the output from the server that we saw just a second ago, and there it is, but now both clients are going to individually receive the command from the server, because the server is looping over all of the socket lists, or looping over the socket list rather. And so we can see that illustrated here. The next function on the list I wanted to cover is the reset next socket function. So this is pretty straightforward. It just resets the loop list to the beginning of the loop. So let me just do a real quick copy here. We'll go back to my terminal windows. We'll open up the server source file where we are looping over the client connections. And what you would probably want to do is just put it right before the loop, just to make sure that the list always starts at the beginning. In the case that I just showed you, it was already always starting at the beginning. The way that the next socket function works is that if you loop all the way to the end of the list, it'll automatically reset to the start for the next time you want to go through that list. But if for any reason you want to break out in the middle before you get to the end of that list, then you'll need to use the reset next socket so that it resets it back to the start. But if you just want to play it safe, you can go ahead and issue the reset next socket before any time you loop over the socket list, and it'll just ensure that it always starts from the beginning. So the next function on the list is the terminate function. This is pretty simple and straightforward. If you call it, the program dies. That's pretty much it. So let's illustrate that for you real quick. Let me open up my server source file. I've modified the previous loop, particularly the write socket function, to send the command die. And if I open up my client source file, I have a command function called receive die, and it prints a message that it says it received the die command, and then it calls the terminate function. And as per usual with all command functions, right here is where I say, when I receive the die command, execute receive die function. So pretty simple. It's going to connect, it's going to receive the die command from the server, and it's going to exit. So let's just show it real quick. We just have to wait for that periodic function to kick off on the server side. And there it goes. Receive die command from server, killing myself, boom, shutting down, reason terminated. So Simple and straightforward. And finally, we have the write log and print log functions. Both of these functions add an entry to the log file. I'll show you where the log file is located, by the way. And they both work exactly like the printf function. Matter of fact, they're printf wrappers. So you just specify a formatted string and then all of your format parameters. And so why don't I just go ahead and show you real quick where the log file is located. And to do that, I'll show you where the setting is. And the setting for the log file is in your config.h. Let's scroll down here, and if we scroll down, we see where that is defined. The server log file name, the client log file name, and the log file path is where they're both located. This can be a relative path, or it can be a full path. So if you don't want this to run under a user that doesn't have a home directory, you don't want to specify a relative path, because the relative path will always be relative to the home directory. So in that case, you want to specify a full path to wherever you want it to be logged at. So anyway, yeah, go ahead and change these if you want different names, a different path. I'm just going to keep them the same for this demonstration. Let me open up my server file. And I've modified the periodic function that we just used. So now that it writes an entry to the log and it says sending die command to socket %i, and then it sends the die command. So let's make that. And before we go ahead and run it, I'm going to tail the log file. So in this window, you can see I'm in my log file directory, and there they are. So let's tail the server log and just watch what's going on. Now we start up the server, and we can see the log file shows the server starting up. Over here, let's start up the client. And we can see where it connected. It logs our IP address, what socket we received, and then boom, we just received the die command, and there it is, the command that logs it to the log file, sending die command to socket 5. Now let me close that. Now if I open up my server source file again, that was the write log. The other one is print log, and this is nearly identical, except not only does it add the same entry to the log file, it also prints it to standard out. So let's just demonstrate that. We'll remake the server and client. We'll run the server, and we'll run the client, and we should see the output in this window as well as the log file, and there we go. So it's just a convenient way. If you want to log something and print it to standard out, you can do it all within one command. There's only one other sort of little thing you should know about the both of these commands, the print and write log, is they automatically append a new line character, so you don't actually have to append or use your own new line character. So I would just suggest don't use a new line unless you absolutely want to log something in multiple line format. Okay, so that should be it for all the function tools. I hope it was informative, and thanks for watching.